Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board brought back my dead pet, but it's not the same. I know this is going to sound completely insane, but I swear to you, every word is true. I just need to get this off my chest because I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't even think straight anymore. My name is Jake, and about 3 months ago, my life took a horrifying turn that I never saw coming. It all started on a rainy Saturday night. My girlfriend, Emily, had gone out with some friends, and I was left alone in our apartment. I was feeling pretty down because earlier that week, my beloved cat, Muffin, had died. Muffin was more than just a pet. She was my best friend. She had been with me through some really tough times, and losing her felt like losing a part of myself. That night, I was scrolling through Reddit, trying to distract myself, when I stumbled upon a thread about Ouija boards. People were sharing their experiences, most of them creepy, but also kind of intriguing. I'd never believed in that kind of stuff, but in my grief-stricken state, I thought, what the hell? Maybe it'll help me feel connected to Muffin again. So I decided to give it a try. I found an old Ouija board in the back of my closet. It had been a gag gift from a friend years ago, and I'd never even taken it out of the box. I set it up on the coffee table, lit a few candles, and turned off the lights. The room was dimly lit, and the rain tapping against the windows added to the eerie atmosphere. I placed my fingers on the planchette, and feeling a bit foolish, I began to speak. "Is there anyone here who wants to talk to me?" I asked, my voice shaky. For a long moment, nothing happened. I felt silly and almost gave up. But then, the planchette began to move. Slowly at first, then more deliberately. It spelled out Hello. My heart pounded in my chest. I took a deep breath and asked, "Who am I speaking to?" The planchette moved again, faster this time. MU for FIN. Tears welled up in my eyes. "Muffin? Is that really you?" Yes. I couldn't believe it. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I missed Muffin so much, and the idea of being able to communicate with her, even through a Ouija board, was overwhelming. I asked her a few questions, and the answers were all things only Muffin would know. It was comforting in a weird way, until I asked one final question that I now regret more than anything. "Do you want to come back?" The planchette didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Just as I was about to give up, it slid to YES. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, I was filled with a desperate hope. I wanted my cat back no matter what. I didn't think about the consequences, or the fact that I was meddling with forces I didn't understand. I just wanted Muffin back. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was in a dark forest and I could hear Muffin's meow echoing through the trees. I followed the sound until I found her sitting by a tree, staring at me with her big green eyes. I reached out to pet her, but as soon as my hand touched her fur, I woke up. I thought it was just a dream, a manifestation of my grief and the strange experience with the Ouija board. But the next morning, I found something on my doorstep that made my blood run cold. There was a small, wet spot on the doormat, like something had been sitting there in the rain. And in the middle of the wet spot was a clump of fur, Muffin's fur. I didn't know what to think. I brought the fur inside, hoping it was just a coincidence. Maybe a stray cat had been there during the night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a familiar sound. It was faint, but unmistakable. The soft padding of paws on the hardwood floor. My heart leaped into my throat. I followed the sound to the living room, and there, sitting in the middle of the room, was Muffin. Or at least, it looked like Muffin. But something was off. Her fur was matted and dirty, and her eyes had a strange, glassy look. She didn't move or purr when I called her name. She just stared at me, unblinking. I reached out to pet her, but as soon as my hand touched her fur, she hissed and bolted out of the room. I was left standing there, heart pounding, wondering what the hell I had brought back. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Muffin, or whatever she had become, was not the same. She didn't act like the affectionate, playful cat I remembered. She was distant, almost aggressive. She would hiss and scratch if I got too close, and sometimes I would catch her staring at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but things escalated quickly. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my bedroom door. It was relentless, like she was trying to claw her way in. I opened the door to find her standing there, staring at me. Her eyes seemed to glow in the dark, and her fur was even more matted and filthy. I shut the door and locked it, my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night, and the scratching continued until dawn. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, she was gone. But the worst was yet to come. The following days were a living nightmare. I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in my apartment wasn't really Muffin. It looked like her, but every time I looked into those lifeless eyes, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like staring into a void, and the more I looked, the more I realized that whatever had come back wasn't my cat. I tried to go about my daily routine, but it was impossible to ignore the changes. I would wake up with scratches on my arms and legs, deep and bleeding, as if I'd been attacked by something in my sleep. Emily noticed them too, and when I tried to explain, she just looked at me like I was crazy. "Jake, you need to see someone. This isn't normal," she said, her voice filled with concern. I wanted to tell her everything, but how could I? She'd never believe me. So I lied, telling her I'd scratched myself by accident. She didn't press further, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. One night, after another sleepless night filled with the sound of scratching and distant eerie meows, I decided I needed to find out what was really going on. I took out my phone and started recording, hoping to capture whatever was happening. At around 3 a.m, I heard the familiar sound of paws on the floor. I turned on the camera and followed the sound to the living room. There she was, or it was, sitting in the middle of the room again. This time, her fur was even more matted, and there were patches missing, revealing raw, red skin underneath. She looked at me, her eyes glowing in the dim light. "Muffin," I whispered, my voice trembling. She hissed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. I took a step back, but she stayed where she was, staring at me with those unblinking eyes. I recorded for a few more minutes before retreating to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. The video showed Muffin, but as I watched, her form seemed to flicker like a glitch in a video game. For brief moments, she didn't look like a cat at all. Her limbs were too long, her eyes too wide, her mouth filled with too many teeth. It was as if something else was wearing her skin. I needed answers. I went back to the Ouija board, desperate and terrified. I set it up again, my hands shaking as I placed my fingers on the planchette. "Who am I speaking to?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The planchette moved slowly. Muffin. "No, I don't believe you. What are you?" I demanded. The planchette paused, then moved again. Demon. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. "What do you want?" The answer came quickly. "You." I ripped my hands away from the board, my heart pounding. I could hear the scratching at my bedroom door again, but this time it was accompanied by a low growling. I grabbed my phone and called Emily. "Emily, you need to come home, now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Jake, what's going on? Are you okay?" she asked, worry evident in her voice. "Just please, come home. I'll explain everything when you get here." Emily arrived about half an hour later. I was sitting on the couch, the Ouija board in front of me, the room filled with the smell of burning candles. She took one look at me and knew something was terribly wrong. "Jake, what is this?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. I explained everything, from the night I used the Ouija board to the strange behaviour of Muffin and the terrifying messages I'd received. She listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler with every word. "We need to get rid of it," she said finally, her voice firm. "Whatever it is, it doesn't belong here." We gathered everything, the Ouija board, the candles, and anything that could be connected to the summoning. We took it all outside to the backyard and set it on fire. The flames roared to life and I felt a strange sense of relief as I watched it burn. But as the fire died down, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, rumbling growl coming from the shadows at the edge of the yard. Emily and I turned, and there, standing in the darkness, were two glowing eyes. They were the same eyes that had been staring at me from the body of my beloved cat. We ran back into the house, slamming the door behind us. I could hear the growling getting louder, and then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The house was eerily silent, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I heard it. A soft, menacing whisper, right behind me. "You're mine now, Jake." I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, dark hallway. Emily grabbed my hand, her grip tight. "We need to leave, now." We packed a few essentials and left the house, driving to a friend's place. I didn't sleep that night, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. We stayed with our friend for a few days, hoping that whatever we had summoned would go away. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever it wasn't going to let me go that easily. And I was right. Emily and I stayed at our friend's house for a few days, but the sense of dread never left me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes and heard that menacing whisper. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling a presence that I couldn't see but knew was there. One night, about a week after we'd left the house, I woke up to find Emily standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Emily, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice shaky. She turned to me slowly, her expression blank. "It's here, Jake. It followed us." I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up and looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. Just the empty street and the faint glow of the streetlights. But I knew better than to trust what my eyes were telling me. We decided to go back to the house the next day. We couldn't hide forever, and I needed to confront whatever it was that had taken over my life. When we arrived, the house looked the same as we had left it, but there was an oppressive atmosphere that hadn't been there before. The air felt heavy, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. We cautiously stepped inside, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The house was freezing, much colder than it should have been. Our breath fogged the air, and I could hear a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere deep within the house. "Stay close," I told Emily, grabbing a flashlight. We slowly made our way through the house, checking each room. Everything looked normal, but the sense of unease was growing stronger. When we reached the living room, I saw it. The Ouija board, the one we had burned, was sitting on the coffee table, completely intact. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. This couldn't be happening. We had destroyed it. "Jake, look," Emily whispered, pointing to the wall. There, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "You can't escape." I felt a surge of panic. We needed to leave, now, but as we turned to go, the door slammed shut, and the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath coming out in rapid puffs as I tried to calm myself down. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. I shone the flashlight towards it, and there, standing in the darkness, was Muffin, or at least it looked like her. But her body was twisted and contorted, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "Muffin," I whispered, my voice trembling. The creature let out a bone-chilling hiss and started to move towards us. Emily screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the back door. We stumbled through the kitchen, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like it was welded shut. "Jake, what do we do?" Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. I didn't have an answer. I felt utterly helpless. The growling grew louder, and I turned to see the creature getting closer, its twisted form moving unnaturally. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a kitchen knife and stood in front of Emily. "Stay behind me," I said, my voice shaking. The creature stopped a few feet away from us, its eyes locked onto mine. I could feel its hatred, its desire to harm, and then it spoke in a voice that was a distorted version of my own. "Jake, you brought me back. Now you're mine." I swung the knife at it, but it moved too quickly, darting out of the way and disappearing into the shadows. The lights flickered, and the house was plunged into darkness. Emily was sobbing, and I felt completely lost. How do you fight something that isn't even fully in this world? I tried to think, to come up with a plan, but all I could feel was the overwhelming sense of dread. And then, out of the darkness, I heard the whisper again. "You're mine, Jake. Forever." Suddenly, the room filled with an oppressive force, like a giant hand pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, Emily shaking me. "Jake, wake up! Please!" I opened my eyes and saw her terrified face looking down at me. "We need to leave," I managed to choke out. We stumbled out of the house, not looking back. The moment we stepped outside, the oppressive feeling lifted, and I could breathe again. We got into the car and drove without a destination, just needing to put as much distance between us and that house as possible. We ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town. It was dingy and smelled like mildew, but at least it felt safe. I spent the night holding Emily, trying to reassure her, but the truth was, I was just as terrified. I didn't know what to do or how to get rid of whatever I had brought back. The next morning, I did some research. I found stories similar to mine, people who had used Ouija boards and ended up summoning something they couldn't control. There were mentions of cleansing rituals, exorcisms, and even priests who specialized in these kinds of situations. I knew I needed help, real help. I reached out to a local priest who had a reputation for dealing with the supernatural, Father Donovan. He agreed to meet us at the house the next day. When we arrived, Father Donovan was already there, standing in front of the house with a solemn expression. "You did something very dangerous, Jake," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But we can fix this. We need to perform a cleansing ritual and send whatever it is back to where it came from." We entered the house together, the oppressive atmosphere returning the moment we stepped inside. Father Donovan began to set up for the ritual, lighting candles and sprinkling holy water around the room. He chanted prayers, and I felt a glimmer of hope. But as the ritual continued, the house seemed to fight back. The lights flickered, and a cold wind blew through the room. The growling started again, and I saw the creature, Muffin's twisted form, standing at the edge of the light. "Keep praying," Father Donovan urged. "We can do this." The creature lunged at us, and I swung the knife again, this time making contact. It let out an ear-piercing screech and disappeared into the shadows. Father Donovan continued chanting, his voice growing louder and more determined. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, and the oppressive force lifted. The house went silent, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Father Donovan lowered his hands, his face pale but resolute. "It's done," he said. "But you must never, ever use a Ouija board again, Jake. You opened a door that should never have been opened." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. Emily and I left the house, determined to start over. We found a new apartment in a different part of town, far away from the memories of that house. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. I hear whispers in the dark, and sometimes I catch a glimpse of glowing eyes in the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever be free of what I brought back. All I know is that I'll never touch a Ouija board again. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Emily and I settled into our new apartment, hoping that we had left the nightmare behind. For a while, things seemed to be getting better. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, and the whispers and growling that had haunted us were now just terrible memories. We tried to move on with our lives, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The first sign that the nightmare wasn't over came about a month after we moved in. It was a quiet evening, and Emily was out with friends while I stayed home to catch up on some work. I was sitting at my desk when I heard a faint scratching sound. My heart skipped a beat. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way towards the sound. As I entered the living room, the scratching stopped and everything was silent. I swept the flashlight around the room, but saw nothing unusual. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it. A small wet spot on the floor, just like the one I'd found on the doormat when this all started. My stomach churned with dread. I bent down to get a closer look and found a clump of fur, Muffin's fur. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. We had cleansed the house, gotten rid of the Ouija board, but the evidence was right in front of me. The thing that had come back was still with us. I called Emily, my voice trembling. "Emily, you need to come home. Something's wrong." "Jake, what is it? Are you okay?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Just come home, please." She arrived about 20 minutes later, and I showed her the wet spot and the fur. Her face went pale, and she clutched my arm. "Jake, what does this mean? I thought it was over." "I don't know," I admitted, fear gripping my heart. "But we need to be careful." The next few nights were tense. We barely slept, jumping at every little noise. The scratching sounds returned, louder and more persistent. Emily started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, whispering about glowing eyes and menacing whispers. One night, as we lay in bed, the scratching started again, but this time it was accompanied by a low growl. I grabbed the flashlight and crept towards the sound. It was coming from the hallway. As I shone the light down the hall, I saw them, two glowing eyes staring back at me. My blood ran cold. "Emily, stay in the bedroom," I whispered, my voice shaking. I stepped into the hallway, the flashlight beam shaking as I tried to keep my hand steady. The eyes blinked, and I heard the growl again, louder this time. It sounded like it was right in front of me. I took another step forward, and the creature lunged at me from the shadows. I fell back, the flashlight clattering to the floor. In the dim light, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was Muffin, but her body was horribly twisted, her fur matted and patchy, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. She hissed, baring too many sharp teeth. "Get back!" I yelled, scrambling to my feet. The creature advanced, its movements jerky and unnatural. Emily screamed from the bedroom, and the creature's head snapped towards the sound. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it at the creature, hitting it with a sickening thud. It let out a screech and retreated into the shadows, disappearing from sight. I ran back to the bedroom and locked the door behind me. Emily was crying, and I held her close, trying to reassure her, even though I was terrified myself. "We need help," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to find someone who can really get rid of this thing." The next day, I called Father Donovan again, explaining what had happened. He listened patiently, then sighed. "Jake, it sounds like this entity has latched onto you. The cleansing ritual we performed was a temporary fix. We need to do something more powerful to break its hold on you." Father Donovan agreed to meet us at the apartment that evening. He brought along another priest, Father Thomas, who specialized in exorcisms. They set up for the ritual, lighting candles and placing religious artifacts around the apartment. "This will be intense," Father Donovan warned. "You both need to be prepared for anything." The priests began chanting in Latin, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped rapidly. I could see my breath fogging in front of me as the oppressive force returned stronger than ever. Suddenly, the scratching started again, this time from all around us. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, and the growling grew louder. Emily clung to me, her eyes wide with fear. Father Thomas stepped forward, holding a crucifix. "Reveal yourself, demon," he commanded. The creature emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and flickering. It lunged at Father Thomas, but he held the crucifix up, and the creature recoiled with a screech. "You have no power here," Father Thomas shouted, his voice strong and unwavering. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave this place." The creature howled, its form twisting and contorting. The air was filled with the sound of its screeches and the priest's chants. I felt a pressure building, like the very walls of the apartment were closing in on us. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the creature let out one final agonizing scream and disappeared. The oppressive force lifted, and the apartment fell silent. Father Donovan and Father Thomas looked exhausted but relieved. "It's over," Father Donovan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "The entity is gone." Emily and I hugged each other, tears of relief streaming down our faces. For the first time in months, I felt like we could finally move on with our lives. But even as we thanked the priests and began to clean up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. I told myself it was just residual fear, a leftover from the trauma we'd experienced. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. In the weeks that followed the exorcism, things seemed to return to normal. Emily and I did our best to rebuild our lives, clinging to the hope that the nightmare was finally behind us. The apartment felt lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere was gone. But despite the improvements, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. I started having nightmares again. Dark, vivid dreams where I was lost in a forest, with the glowing eyes always watching me from the shadows. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the whispers of, "You're mine, Jake," echoing in my ears. I didn't tell Emily about the dreams. She'd been through enough, and I didn't want to worry her. One night, after a particularly disturbing nightmare, I woke up to find Emily sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "Jake," she whispered, "I think it's back." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the corner of the room. There, barely visible in the dim light, were two glowing eyes. They blinked slowly, then disappeared into the darkness. The scratching started again, louder and more insistent than ever. I knew we couldn't run anymore. This thing had followed us from the old house, and it wasn't going to let us go until it got what it wanted. I needed to confront it once and for all. The next day, I went to see Father Donovan and Father Thomas. I explained what had happened, and they agreed to help us one last time. We needed to perform a final, more powerful ritual to banish the entity permanently. That evening, we set up in the apartment again, this time with more religious artifacts and stronger protective measures. The priest warned us that this would be the most dangerous ritual yet, but it was our only hope. As the priest began chanting, the temperature in the room dropped again, and the oppressive force returned. Stronger than ever, the lights flickered, and the scratching grew louder, echoing through the apartment. "Stay strong," Father Donovan urged. "We can do this." The air was thick with tension as the chanting grew louder. Suddenly, the creature appeared, its form even more twisted and malevolent than before. It lunged at Father Thomas, who held up the crucifix, forcing it back. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave this place," Father Thomas shouted, his voice filled with determination. The creature howled, its body convulsing and writhing. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the pressure was overwhelming. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the very air was being sucked out of the room. Emily screamed as the creature lunged at her, but I stepped in front, holding the only weapon I had, a kitchen knife. "Leave us alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and desperation. The creature paused, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. "You're mine, Jake," it whispered, its voice a distorted echo of my own. "No," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "You have no power over me. I brought you back, and now I'm sending you away." Father Donovan and Father Thomas intensified their chants, their voices merging into a powerful, resonant command. The creature shrieked, its form flickering like a bad television signal. The air around us seemed to vibrate with energy. With a final, ear-piercing scream, the creature's form twisted violently and then imploded, disappearing in a burst of light and shadow. The oppressive force lifted, and the apartment fell silent. The priests lowered their hands, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," Father Donovan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This time, it's really over." Emily and I hugged each other. tears of relief streaming down our faces. The nightmare that had haunted us for so long was finally over. We thanked the priest profusely, knowing we owed them our lives. In the days that followed, the apartment felt lighter and more peaceful. The nightmares stopped, and the scratching was gone. We started to rebuild our lives, this time with a sense of hope and optimism. But even as we moved on, a part of me remained vigilant. I knew that the supernatural world was real, and that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. I vowed never to touch a Ouija board again, and to be wary of the unseen forces that lurk in the shadows. Life gradually returned to normal. Emily and I focused on our future, trying to put the past behind us. But every now and then, when the night was particularly dark and the wind howled outside, I would remember the glowing eyes and the sinister whispers, and I would remind myself that some nightmares are best left undisturbed. The Ouija board gave me a message from beyond the grave. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, demons, all of it seemed like a load of crap to me. But that all changed one night, and I've been living with the consequences ever since. It's taken me a while to gather the courage to write this down, but I feel like I need to share what happened to me, if only to warn others. It started innocently enough. A few friends and I were hanging out one Saturday night, drinking and looking for something fun to do. Someone mentioned they had a Ouija board, and we all laughed at the idea. It seemed like a perfect way to pass the time and maybe spook each other out a bit. In hindsight, I wish we had just stuck to drinking and playing video games. We set up the board in my living room, turning off most of the lights to set the mood. It was just the four of us, me, my girlfriend Emily, my best friend Jake, and his girlfriend Lisa. We all sat in a circle around the board, placing our fingers lightly on the planchette. Emily, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes as we began. "Is there anyone here with us?" Jake asked, his voice mock serious. For a long moment, nothing happened. We all exchanged glances, stifling giggles. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. At first, I thought one of my friends was messing with us, but the looks on their faces told me otherwise. The planchette moved to yes. "Okay, who's here with us?" Emily asked, her tone still skeptical, but with a hint of curiosity. The planchette spelled out a name, Sam. "Sam, huh? Were you a person once?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Yes," the board responded. "What happened to you?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette began to move faster, almost frantically. It spelled out, Murder. We all went silent, staring at each other in the dim light. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach. This wasn't funny anymore. "Who murdered you, Sam?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. The planchette spelled out another name, Eli. "Who is Eli?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. The response came quickly, Brother. At this point, Emily pulled her hand away from the planchette. "This is bullshit," she said, standing up. "Someone's messing with us." Before any of us could respond, the planchette moved again, faster and more erratically than before. It spelled out Emily. We all stared at the board in shock. "Emily, sit back down," Jake said, his voice tense. "We need to see this through." Emily reluctantly sat back down, placing her fingers on the planchette again. "What do you want with Emily?" I asked, my voice barely steady. The planchette spelled out one word, Die. Emily gasped, pulling her hands back again. "I'm done with this," she said, standing up and backing away from the board. We all sat there in stunned silence for a moment. Then, the planchette started moving again, even though none of us were touching it. It moved to goodbye. "Okay, that's enough," I said, reaching out to grab the board. But as soon as my hand touched it, a jolt of pain shot through my arm. I yanked my hand back, staring at the board in horror. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know, but I'm not touching that thing again," I said, standing up and backing away. We all agreed to put the board away and try to forget about what had happened. But that night, As I lay in bed next to Emily, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. A few days later, strange things started happening around the house. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and we would hear whispers in the middle of the night. At first, we tried to ignore it, chalking it up to our imaginations, but it only got worse. One night, I woke up to find Emily standing at the foot of our bed, staring down at me with a blank expression on her face. Her eyes were open, but it was like she wasn't really there. I called her name, but she didn't respond. It was only when I shook her that she seemed to snap out of it, looking around in confusion. "I don't know what's happening to me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The next day, I found scratches on my arms and legs, like something had clawed at me in my sleep. Emily had no memory of doing it, and I had no memory of anything happening during the night. But the scratches were real, and they hurt like hell. Things continued to escalate. Emily started having nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. She would tell me about seeing a dark figure standing at the foot of our bed, whispering her name. I started staying up late, trying to watch over her, but the figure never appeared when I was awake. One night, I woke up to find Emily gone. I searched the house frantically, my heart pounding in my chest. I found her in the basement, standing in front of the Ouija board. The planchette was moving on its own, spelling out the same word over and over again, DIE. I grabbed her and pulled her away from the board, shaking her until she woke up. She looked at me with terror in her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what's happening to me," she sobbed. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." We decided to get rid of the board, hoping that would put an end to whatever was happening. We burned it in the backyard, watching as the flames consumed it. But it didn't stop. If anything, things got worse. Emily's condition deteriorated rapidly. She started having violent outbursts, screaming and thrashing around for no reason. She would claw at her own skin, leaving deep, bloody gashes. I tried to get her to see a doctor, but she refused, insisting that there was nothing they could do to help her. One night, I woke up to find her standing over me with a knife in her hand. Her eyes were wide and crazed, and she was whispering something under her breath. I managed to wrestle the knife away from her, but not before she slashed my arm open. I called 911, and they took her away to the hospital. She's been in and out of psychiatric care ever since. The doctors say she's suffering from some kind of severe psychosis, but I know the truth. Whatever we contacted with that Ouija board, it's still with us, and it's not going to let go. I can still feel its presence in the house, watching, waiting. Sometimes I hear whispers in the middle of the night, calling my name. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I don't know if I'll ever be free of it, but I had to share my story, to warn others. Don't mess with Ouija boards. You have no idea what you're inviting into your life. After Emily was taken to the hospital, I thought things would calm down. I was wrong. The presence in the house seemed to grow stronger, more malevolent. Every corner I turned, I felt like I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, fleeting glimpses of a dark figure standing in the doorway, or a face peering at me from the windows. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a reaction to the stress of everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew it was something more. One night, about a week after Emily had been admitted, I was woken up by a loud crash from the living room. My heart pounding, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and crept down the hallway. The living room was dark, but I could see that the furniture had been overturned. Books scattered across the floor. As I stepped into the room, the temperature dropped suddenly, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I felt a chill run down my spine as I saw a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness. It was tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to glow with a malevolent light. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I swung the bat, but it passed right through the figure, hitting nothing but air. The figure continued to advance, and I felt an icy hand wrap around my throat, squeezing tightly. I struggled to breathe, my vision going dark around the edges. Just when I thought I was about to pass out, the grip loosened and the figure vanished. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my heart racing. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat in the corner of my bedroom with the lights on, clutching the bat and praying for dawn to come. When the first light of morning finally filtered through the windows, I felt a small measure of relief, but I knew it was only temporary. Desperate for answers, I began researching everything I could about Ouija boards, spirits, and hauntings. I spent hours combing through websites, forums, and old books, looking for anything that might help me understand what was happening. I even reached out to a few paranormal investigators, but most of them dismissed my story as a hoax or a cry for attention. One night, as I was digging through yet another website, I found a post that caught my eye. It was written by someone who had experienced something similar, a spirit that had latched onto them after using a Ouija board. They described seeing dark figures, feeling cold spots, and hearing whispers. But most importantly, they mentioned a way to break the connection. According to the post, I needed to perform a cleansing ritual. It involved burning sage, sprinkling salt in the corners of each room, and reciting a specific incantation. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie, but at that point, I was willing to try anything. I gathered the supplies and prepared to perform the ritual. As I walked through the house, burning the sage and sprinkling the salt, I could feel the air grow heavier, like the very walls were pressing in on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I forced myself to keep going. When I reached the final room, the basement, I hesitated. The basement had always given me the creeps, even before all of this started, but I knew I had to finish what I had started. I descended the stairs, the cold, damp air wrapping around me like a shroud. As I began to sprinkle the salt, I heard a low growl behind me. I turned to see the dark figure from before, standing at the bottom of the stairs. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and I could feel its hatred radiating towards me. "Leave this place!" I shouted, throwing a handful of salt at the figure. It recoiled, hissing like a wounded animal. I continued to sprinkle the salt, reciting the incantation as loudly as I could. The figure seemed to writhe and twist, its form flickering in and out of existence. Just as I thought I was making progress, the figure lunged at me, knocking the salt from my hand. I fell to the ground, the breath knocked out of me. The figure loomed over me, its eyes burning with fury. In a last desperate effort, I grabbed the sage and held it up like a shield. The figure shrieked and retreated, its form dissolving into the shadows. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The basement felt different now, lighter somehow. I could still feel a residual unease, but the oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone. I finished the ritual and made my way back upstairs, collapsing onto the couch in exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, I slept without nightmares, but my relief was short-lived. The next day, I received a call from the hospital. Emily had taken a turn for the worse. I rushed to her side, my heart heavy with fear. She looked pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and sunken. She barely seemed to recognize me, her gaze distant and unfocused. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can see them, in the shadows." I held her hand, trying to comfort her, but I knew there was nothing I could say to ease her fear. Whatever had attached itself to us through the Ouija board wasn't done with us yet, and I was terrified of what it would do next. After that phone call from the hospital, my life took a turn for the worse. Emily's condition deteriorated rapidly, and I could see the light in her eyes fading every time I visited her. She was haunted by the dark figure, just as I was, and it seemed like there was nothing anyone could do to help her. One night, after visiting Emily, I returned home to find my front door ajar. My heart raced as I cautiously stepped inside, gripping my baseball bat tightly. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your skin crawl. I moved from room to room, checking for any signs of an intruder, but everything seemed normal. until I reached the living room. The temperature plummeted, and my breath formed misty clouds in the air. The dark figure was there, standing by the window, staring at me with those malevolent eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it pointed a skeletal finger at me, its eyes glowing brighter. Suddenly, I was hit with a wave of nausea, and my vision blurred. I stumbled back, trying to stay on my feet, but the room spun around me. When my vision cleared, I found myself in a different place. It looked like my living room, but everything was distorted, twisted. The walls were covered in what looked like pulsing dark veins, and the air was thick with a stench of decay. I turned around to see the figure standing right behind me, its eyes boring into mine. I felt a searing pain in my chest, like something was trying to rip my heart out. I screamed, but no sound came out. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I was snapped back to reality. I was lying on the floor of my living room, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence lingering in the room. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed a bag with some essentials and left, not caring where I was going as long as it was far away from there. I ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, hoping that putting some distance between me and the house would help. But the haunting followed me. The first night in the motel, I woke up to the sound of scratching at the door. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sound grew louder and more insistent. I opened the door to find nothing there, but the air was icy cold and I could feel eyes on me. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I called Jake. I hadn't spoken to him since the night we used the Ouija board, and I needed to know if he was experiencing anything similar. "Jake, it's me. Have you noticed anything strange happening lately?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Yeah, man, weird shit's been happening. Lisa and I are both freaked out. She's been seeing shadows, hearing whispers. We didn't know what to do." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. It wasn't just me. Whatever we had unleashed, it was affecting all of us. I told Jake about the ritual I had performed and suggested he try it too, though I wasn't sure how much it would help. Days turned into weeks, and things only got worse. The haunting followed me wherever I went. Dark figures, whispers, and cold spots became a part of my daily life. I started seeing Emily's face in the shadows, her eyes hollow and pleading. It was like she was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand her. One night, as I was driving back to the motel after visiting Emily, my car suddenly stalled on a deserted road. The engine died, and all the electronics went out, plunging me into darkness. I tried to restart the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I felt a chill run down my spine as I saw a figure standing in the road ahead, illuminated by the faint moonlight. It was Emily, but it wasn't her. Her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pain and anger, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Why didn't you save me?" she hissed, her voice echoing in the still night air. "I tried, Emily. I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. She moved closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on strings. "You didn't try hard enough. You left me to suffer." The guilt and fear were overwhelming. I felt like I was drowning in it. "Please, tell me how to help you," I begged. Her face twisted into a cruel smile. "You can't help me. It's too late for that. But you can join me." Before I could react, she lunged at me, her hands wrapping around my throat. I struggled, but her grip was like iron. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, the car's engine roared to life and the headlights flickered on. Emily vanished, leaving me gasping for air. I didn't go back to the motel that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly until dawn, trying to make sense of what had happened. I knew I couldn't keep running. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it had consumed me completely. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator named Claire. I had found her contact information online, and her credentials seemed legit. I explained my situation to her, hoping she could offer some insight or help. Claire agreed to meet with me and perform an investigation of the house. She arrived a few days later, equipped with various tools and a determined expression. We walked through the house together, and she took readings, snapping photos and recording audio. "This place is definitely active," she said, reviewing her findings. "I'm picking up strong electromagnetic fields and temperature fluctuations. There's definitely something here." I felt a glimmer of hope. "Can you get rid of it?" Claire looked uncertain. "I can try, but these things can be tricky. Sometimes they latch onto a person, not just a place. If that's the case, it might be harder to get rid of." We decided to perform a more thorough cleansing ritual, hoping it would banish whatever was haunting me. Claire instructed me to gather specific items: candles, holy water, protective talismans, and we set up the ritual in the living room. As we began, the air grew thick with tension, the temperature dropped, and the lights flickered ominously. Claire chanted in a language I didn't understand, sprinkling holy water around the room. I followed her instructions, lighting candles and holding the protective talisman close. Suddenly, the dark figure appeared, more solid and menacing than ever before. It lashed out at Claire, knocking her to the ground. I rushed to her side, but the figure was relentless, its malevolent eyes fixed on me. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "You belong to us now." The room filled with a deafening roar, and the candles blew out, plunging us into darkness. I felt an icy hand wrap around my throat, lifting me off the ground. I struggled, clawing at the invisible force, but it was no use. Just when I thought it was the end, Claire threw something at the figure, a vial of holy water. The figure shrieked, its grip loosening enough for me to break free. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, as the figure dissolved into the shadows. "We did it," Claire said, her voice shaky. "We weakened it, but it's not gone, not completely." I looked around the room, feeling the residual presence of the entity. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to strike. I knew the battle was far from over. After that night, things didn't improve. The entity was still there, lurking, and its presence felt even more oppressive. Claire tried to reassure me that we had weakened it, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She suggested I take a break from the house and stay somewhere else, but I knew deep down it wouldn't help. Whatever this thing was, it was attached to me, and it wasn't going to let go. I moved back into the motel, trying to keep some semblance of normalcy in my life. I visited Emily every day, but her condition continued to deteriorate. She was barely recognizable, her once vibrant personality reduced to a hollow shell. Every time I looked into her eyes, I saw the darkness that had consumed her, and it terrified me. One night, I returned to my motel room to find the door slightly ajar. My heart raced as I pushed it open, my senses on high alert. The room was dark, and the air felt heavy and cold. As I fumbled for the light switch, I felt a presence behind me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. There was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing. I spun around, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. The figure was there, standing in the corner, its eyes glowing with that same malevolent light. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice echoing in the small room. I backed away, my mind racing. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The entity had followed me, and it was stronger than ever. I could feel its anger, its hatred, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it claimed me. I spent the next few days in a state of constant fear, jumping at every shadow, every noise. I barely slept, and when I did, I was haunted by nightmares. In my dreams, I saw Emily's twisted face, heard her screams, felt the icy grip of the entity around my throat. Desperate for answers, I reached out to an old friend who had a background in the occult. Mark had always been into the weird and unexplained, and while I'd always brushed off his interests as nonsense, I was now willing to try anything. "Mark, I need your help," I said, my voice trembling as I explained what had been happening. He listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with every word. When I finished, he nodded, his face pale. "Man, this sounds bad," he said, "but I think I know someone who can help. There's this old woman, a sort of spiritual healer. She's dealt with stuff like this before." I didn't have much hope, but I agreed to meet her. Mark set up an appointment, and a few days later, we drove to a small house on the outskirts of town. The woman, who introduced herself as Agatha, was old and frail, but her eyes were sharp and piercing. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice calm and steady. I recounted the events, from the night with the Ouija board to the haunting that had followed. She listened intently, nodding occasionally. "You have been marked," she said finally. "This spirit, this entity, has latched onto you. It seeks to consume you, to drag you into its realm." "Is there any way to stop it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Agatha nodded. "There is a way, but it is dangerous. You must confront it, face it head on. It will try to break you, to feed on your fear, but you must stay strong. Only then can you banish it." She gave me a list of items I would need for the ritual and detailed instructions on what to do. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but I was willing to try anything. That night, I returned to the house with Mark and Agatha. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. We set up the ritual in the living room, placing candles, salt, and protective talismans around the room. Agatha began to chant in a language I didn't understand, her voice steady and unwavering. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. The figure appeared, more solid and menacing than ever before. "You think you can stop me?" it hissed, its voice dripping with contempt. I stepped forward, holding the protective talisman tightly. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure laughed, a horrible, guttural sound. "You should be." It lunged at me, and I felt a searing pain as its icy grip wrapped around my throat. I struggled, but Agatha's chant grew louder, filling the room with a powerful energy. I could see the figure writhing, its form flickering as if it was struggling to maintain its presence. "Stay strong," Agatha shouted. "Don't let it break you." I focused on the talisman, pouring all my willpower into it. The figure shrieked, its grip loosening. I could feel its anger, its desperation. It was trying to hold on, but the power of the ritual was too strong. With a final, ear-piercing scream, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving the room cold and silent. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion. "It's done," Agatha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've banished it." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I knew it wasn't over. The entity might be gone, but the scars it had left behind would never fully heal. I had faced my worst nightmare and survived, but the experience had changed me forever. Emily's condition improved slowly after that. She was never quite the same, but the darkness that had haunted her seemed to fade. We moved to a new town, hoping for a fresh start, but the memories of those terrifying months lingered. I still see shadows out of the corner of my eye, hear whispers in the dead of night, but I try to remind myself that I faced the darkness and won, and as long as I have the strength to keep fighting, I know I can keep the darkness at bay. Despite the relative calm that followed the ritual, the experience left a permanent mark on both Emily and me. We tried to move on, to rebuild our lives, but it was like living with a ghost. The memories of what had happened haunted our every moment, a constant reminder of the darkness we had faced. Emily was discharged from the hospital a few weeks after the ritual. She was frail, both physically and emotionally, but there was a glimmer of the old Emily in her eyes. We decided to leave the old town behind and start anew in a quiet little community far away from the horrors we had endured. The new house was modest but cozy. It had a warmth that our old home never did, and for a while, it seemed like we might finally find peace. We unpacked our things, trying to make the place our own, but the shadows of our past were never far away. Emily had begun seeing a therapist, trying to work through the trauma. I started seeing one too, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. We leaned on each other for support, trying to rebuild our shattered lives. One night, about a month after we had moved in, I was woken by a familiar chill in the air. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to hear any sounds. The house was silent, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I got out of bed and walked through the house, checking each room. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling persisted. I returned to the bedroom and found Emily sitting up, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you feel it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my throat dry. "I thought it was gone," I said, my voice barely audible. We sat there in the darkness, holding each other, too afraid to sleep. The presence was weaker than before, but it was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of our perception. It was like a shadow that wouldn't fade, a reminder that we were never truly free. Days turned into weeks, and the presence remained. It was subtle, barely noticeable at times, but always there. Emily and I tried to ignore it, to live our lives as normally as possible, but it was a constant weight on our shoulders. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard a soft whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. I strained to listen, and the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was familiar, but distorted, like it was coming from a great distance. I stood up and followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from the basement. The basement was dark and cold, the air thick with a sense of dread. I flicked on the light and descended the stairs, my hands shaking. As I reached the bottom, the whisper came again, louder and more desperate. "Help me!" I looked around, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. The basement was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, but nothing seemed out of place. I took a step forward, and my foot hit something hard. I looked down to see the remnants of the old Ouija board we had burned, its edges charred and blackened. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was looking at. The board had been destroyed, but somehow it was still here. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, a shock of cold energy shot through me. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The basement seemed to warp and twist around me, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. I could hear the whisper growing louder, more insistent. "Help me!" I knew I had to do something. I grabbed the remains of the board and took it upstairs, determined to find a way to end this once and for all. Emily was in the kitchen, and when she saw what I was holding, her face went pale. "We need to get rid of it," I said, my voice shaking. "For good this time." We decided to perform another ritual, one that would destroy the board completely and hopefully banish the entity once and for all. We gathered the necessary items and set up in the backyard, hoping the open space would be less vulnerable to the entity's influence. As we began the ritual, the air grew thick with tension. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger. Emily held my hand, her grip tight and reassuring. We recited the incantation Agatha had taught us, sprinkling salt and holy water over the board. The flames flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows around us. The board seemed to pulse with a dark energy, resisting our efforts. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices crying out in desperation. The ground trembled, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. I could see the dark figure materializing before us, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed, its voice echoing in the night. "We have to keep going," Emily shouted over the noise. "Don't stop." I focused all my energy on the ritual, pouring my willpower into the incantation. The figure writhed and twisted, its form flickering like a dying flame. The board began to crack and splinter, the dark energy dissipating. With a final, ear-piercing scream, the figure dissolved into the night, leaving us in stunned silence. The board crumbled to ashes, the dark energy fading away. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. We stood there for a long moment, holding each other, too afraid to believe it was over. But the presence was gone, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. In the weeks that followed, Emily and I slowly began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the shadows less menacing. We took things one day at a time, rebuilding our lives and finding comfort in each other. The experience had changed us, left scars that would never fully heal. But we had faced the darkness and come out the other side, stronger and more resilient. We knew we could never forget what had happened, but we were determined not to let it define us. And so we moved forward, one step at a time, living our lives with the knowledge that we had faced the darkness and won. The shadows still lingered, but they no longer held the same power over us. We were survivors, and we would not be broken.